Good afternoon, everybody. As Simon said, I stopped going to work about 2008, and I got off the board of an NYSE listed company in 2014. So basically, other than writing occasional articles for Asia Times, I'm really enjoying my retirement. Now, we live in America, which is a society that old soldiers are very quickly fade away. Fortunately for me, we Chinese think older you are, wiser you are, so we keep you around and don't throw you away. Also fortunate that I knew Simon, and Simon invited me, so thank you again, Simon. I have lived in Silicon Valley since 1971, and that was even before there was such a thing as Silicon Valley. So I'm delighted today to share with you what I learned and saw during this time. So I'm going to be giving you sort of a historical review. The way my talk will go will be four main sections. I will tell you a little bit about my own background, primarily so that you can understand what I have to say, put in proper context. This is not to say that what I have to say is the only way to enlightenment. There are other ways, I'm sure. But I want to take advantage of being around for so long to share with you the stories of some of the major Chinese-American pioneers in Silicon Valley. They are truly the glass ceiling breakers. And I would say they're the ones that paved the way for succeeding generations, such as folks like you, to succeed. And I'm very honored and pleased to say these people I'm going to talk about are contemporaries and friends of mine. Of course, there is a price to be paid to be successful, and whatever that might mean to each one of you. But since we're talking about how to be successful and what it means to be a leader, I'm going to talk about the qualifications for success, what I think to be the necessary qualities. And the last thing I'm going to say, stereotypes to watch out for. If you don't know it already, and don't feel it already, America is not a level playing field, and you need to be sensitive and aware how that field is tilted against you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So, as I've been writing my autobiography for the benefit of my grandchildren, I reflect and concluded that I've been very fortunate. I have really, truly gotten the best of two worlds. When I finished 6th grade in China before I came, and so I had a solid foundation in Chinese, which I was able to read and maintain by reading 三国演义 when I was younger, the Romance of Three Kingdoms. And then later on in college, those of us from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and grew up in America that can read Chinese, we used to pass wuxia xiaosuo around, the martial arts novels. Secondly, I was very fortunate to get a scholarship to MIT and got a quality education. Third, I met Mei Jen, who became my wife. And without her love and support, I wouldn't be telling you the story here today. Now, I won't go through all the details of my professional career, but I do want you to know that I started out at a major American corporation. It's the predecessor of today's Honeywell. In its day when I joined the company, it was called Allied Chemical. In that company, I was considered a rising star. The company didn't have an organized tuition program, but the corporate VP of R&D one day took me out to lunch and said, George, I want to give you a leave with pay so that you can finish your doctoral program. I was at that time going part-time at Stevens Institute of Technology. So that way I was able to complete my doctoral program fairly quickly and didn't lose my position in the company and didn't lose income while I was doing it. Now, my Chinese background, my technical background, and my consulting experience enabled me to jump off what would be considered a normal career path. And I became an advisor to corporate America on doing business in China. So you can say I had a front row seat as I witnessed the rise of China. Now, my China experience directly led to an invitation to serve on the board of the world's largest integrated resort casino company in the world. So throughout my career, somehow I developed the knack to write very clearly and succinctly. In Putonghua, we would call it 一针见血. Okay. So in my retirement, I'm using my skill to become a regular contributor to the online Asia Times, which I strive to present a point of view that doesn't represent necessarily China's point of view, nor does it represent mainstream America's point of view. What I try to present is the point of view of a Chinese in America. So as I've said at the beginning, hopefully you will consider this very brief self-introduction is to give you the context on the rest of my talk. When my family arrived in the United States, there were around 150,000 Chinese, all of it, all together in the United States, and it represents about 1/10 or 1% of the US population. By the time my wife and I, quote unquote, immigrated to Silicon Valley from New Jersey, the population had tripled. But even so, it was only about 0.2% of the population in the United States. So when we got here, there was no such thing as Silicon Valley, just a lot of fruit orchards in Santa Clara. To buy Chinese groceries, we would have to plan a weekend trip to San Francisco and have a dim sum lunch in Chinatown. Of course, today, there are around 4 million Chinese in America. I can get groceries in Ranch 99 and dim sum lunch about 1.5 miles away from home in Mountain View. That's one measure of how things have changed. And as you can see, I estimate that maybe 200,000 Chinese in Santa Clara. Another way to look at the influence or the impact of Chinese in Silicon Valley is to look at the various different organizations, professional organizations that were formed, and we know some of them because they've already introduced themselves. The Chinese Institute of Engineers was established in 1917 nationally. Now the amateur historian in me noted with some great deal of interest that one of the founders that CIE talks about is Chang Tianyu, the father of Chinese Railroad. What you may not know is that he was one of 120 boys that came to the United States about 12, 13 years old to be educated in New England, went to schools like Yale, MIT, and others. The first batch organized Chinese that came to the U.S. for an education historically, and they were the ones who got on the Transcontinental Railroad in 1871, just shortly after the railroad was completed, to go from San Francisco to New England. So that's a footnote that I thought may be of interest to you. AAMA was established in 1980, and there was a bunch of technical people that gathered around in the cafeteria of my friend, the late Lester Lee, in his company. And at that time, the feeling around Asian Americans in the Valley was that they needed a mutual support networking group. And that's how AAMA got started. I joined AAMA about 1983. I chaired a number of annual conferences starting about 1990, emphasizing cross-border alliances between Silicon Valley and Asia. And then I became chairman of AMA in 1996. Now, AMA started out calling themselves the Asian American Manufacturers Association. Along the way, they changed the name to Asian American Multi-Technology Association. And the reason they changed the name was because nobody manufactures anything anymore. But on the other hand, they needed to find a way to keep the brand because AMA was becoming a very important brand. 10 years after AMA, Monty J started, it was really the idea of then Director of Science Division, Dr. Zhuang Yide, and he thought it was a good idea, and as already introduced, for a networking organization primarily to serve people, expats from Taiwan and companies from Taiwan. And for $1,000, I became a life member, which was a real good deal in retrospect. Shortly after Monty J, as we saw, CASPA was formed a year after that. And of course, that's a reflection, again, of the many engineers coming back and forth between Taiwan and here. Some years later, the Professor Annalise Saxenian of Berkeley, who studied the impact of immigrants on Silicon Valley, she made an observation. She said, in Silicon Valley, IC stands for Indians and Chinese. And without those two groups of immigrants, the valley would have surely imploded. 10 years after Mount J came the formation of Huayuan Science and Technology Association. And this time, most of the founders were from PRC, and they immediately became visible by hosting delegations from mainland China. Last year, I spoke at the first annual conference of the Society of Chinese Physicians Entrepreneurs. The founder of SCAPE was a practicing physician affiliated with Stanford. And I mention this only to show that the formation of professional organizations involving Chinese professionals is ongoing and continuing. It's sort of like what I would call professional versions of Tongxianghui. Now, I don't want to tell you spend some little time telling you about stories of various, what I consider to be real pioneers that break the glass ceiling. First one is David Lee. In the late 60s already, he started a company called Diablo Systems, which was acquired by Xerox. As soon as Xerox took over his company, they put a white guy over him to be in charge of the company that he formed and started. Because in those days, whoever heard of Chinese knowing how to manage? So David left and started another printer company called Koos Systems. And he invented something called a daisy wheel printer. And that was the days before the inkjet and the laser printer. Koos was acquired by ITT. And ITT Corporation, this time, was different. They asked David to stay and run the whole computer peripherals division. And when IBM rolled out and introduced the PC, ITT asked David to figure out a way to compete with IBM. So what David did was took the PC design by ITT and took it to Taiwan and asked Acer and Mytek to make the PC for him as OEM suppliers. And that's how those two companies got into the PC business. And that's how David Lee, Li Xingming is his Chinese name, became known as the father of Taiwan's PC industry. Now since then, David has gone on to run many other companies, serve on the board of many companies, on the advisory board of venture capital. He also took time out during this period to be chairman of CIE, AMA, and Monty J at different times. Very early on, after his reputation was established as a business leader, he saw it was important for Chinese Americans or Asian Americans to be part of the American political process. So he, along with Lester Lee and Stanley Wong, founder of Pentronics, one of the gold sponsors of CASPA, to become actively engaged by raising funds for political candidates. And they also would actively encourage and support Asian candidates, regardless of whether they're running for Republican or Democratic offices. That example has now been followed by many others in Silicon Valley. Now, because of his prominence and activism, he was appointed to serve on the board of regents of the UC system, and he served for 12 years. He's been on many presidential panels and commissions appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents. Now, David Lam. After his PhD from MIT, David landed a position in HP in Silicon Valley. And he was sort of a first or two-tier manager. And all of a sudden, he noticed a white guy that used to be reporting to him has now suddenly become his boss. So David resigned and started Lam Research in 1980. And he became the first Chinese American to take his company public in 1984. And those of you who are members of CASPA would know that Lam Research is one of the major semiconductor manufacturing equipment in the world today. Similar to David Lee, David Lam has gone on to serve on many other ventures, advised many others, and sat on the board. He also sat in presidential and state-level commissions, and in the early 90s, his leadership established AAMA as one of the preeminent networking places for Asian Americans. One of his smartest moves that David did was to recruit Pauline Low to come and run AMA, and she did that from 1991 to 1994. Pauline was a high-energy, charismatic individual. If she comes to ask you to do something, it's very difficult for you not to, quote-unquote, volunteer. She started a mentoring program for young professionals, and under her leadership, AMA became known as the meeting place for valuable networking and relationship building. Pauline started her career with two handicaps. She was female and she was Asian. So even though she had experience in programming in computer programming, she started out as a typist in the computer department of General Electric. However, given the opportunity to show her ability, she moved up very quickly, ended up in a job in Silicon Valley, and soon moved from, and Intel was one of her stops along the way. But from technical positions, she moved into sales and marketing. She became the VP of marketing for Convergent Technologies, which was a real red-hot workstation company in its days. She then went on to start Counterpoint, a workstation company which was acquired by Acer. And just when she decided it was time to take a break and rest, the venture investors of a company called Network Peripherals convinced her to come and run that company, which she did. And she was able to successfully turn that company around and took it public in 1994. At different times, Pauline received national recognition as a leading role model for aspiring women in the high-tech industry. So these three individuals, because they were very capable entrepreneurs, established the credentials that Asian Americans are not just good engineers. And because of their prominent success stories, venture capitalists and Sandhill no longer ignores business plans just because it was an Asian that was submitting the business plan. In fact, some of the firms began to hire partners that were Asian faces. I can't begin to tell you how different Silicon Valley was before and after these pioneers. I truly think that their records paved the way for all of you now. John Chen, next on my list, is a little different. He's been more than a decade younger than the three others I just mentioned. He was not an entrepreneur per se. He was a proven executive, business executive. He was already in senior management positions when Sybase recruited him to run the company. Sybase was literally on a financial death spiral when he took the company. He turned the company around, changed the business focus, made it profitable, and sold it to SAP for $6 billion about 13 years later. And some of you may know he's trying to do the same with BlackBerry right now, and we'll see how he does. John sits on two major corporate boards, Disney and Wells Fargo, as well as a bunch of high-tech startups, and a trustee of a number of national NGOs. Most notable that I admire so much, John led the fund drive to build a library in honor of Chancellor Tianzhang on the Berkeley campus. Next on the list is Bob Lee. Bob Lee stayed within basically one company and became the executive vice president of Pacific Bell. He retired after 26 years. In his day, based on the size of the company, he was the highest ranking corporate officer, highest ranking Chinese ancestry corporate officer in the Bay Area. But he's also chairman of the Blue Shield of California. He served on a number of companies and nonprofits. Most notably, he was on board of Asia Pacific Fund and also youth tennis. Bob was on a varsity tennis team at USC in his younger days. Both Bob and John Chen serve as past chairman of the Committee of 100, a national organization of prominent Chinese Americans. Now, I also need to mention Albert Yu, whose company's auditorium you're sitting. He was a lifer just like Bob Lee. He stayed with one company virtually. The only difference is that during his stint, Intel was virtually a startup and emerged to become the leading semiconductor company in the world. Albert led the Intel's development in the microprocessor, and that was directly a reason for Intel's emergence as a dominant IC company. After 30 years, Albert retired. As their senior vice president, he wrote 2 books on management, Intel style, along with many technical papers. After retirement, he continued to advise companies, sat on boards of many companies. His passion was mentoring Asian Americans. He organized mentoring inside Intel, and he participated on many outside, including the programs that Monty J started. And I saved Ken Fung for last on this because he's not retired, he's still active, and he didn't start an electronics or semiconductor company, he started a biotech company, which he sold to Becton Dickinson for undisclosed hundreds of millions. Ken has been very generous with his wealth. He writes checks for charities, he supports Asian American political candidates, and he was appointed, because of his political activism, he was appointed trustee of the California State University. He was the second one to serve in that capacity. The first trustee of California State University was Stanley Wong of Pentronics. Now, Ken and I have been working on a public forum co-sponsored with the Commonwealth Club to present speakers and topics about U.S.-China relations that you don't usually hear about in the American public mainstream. So, I'm talking about these glass ceiling breakers. This does not mean that that's all there is. I'm sure there are others that I left out. But my point is, by breaking the glass ceiling, they pave the way for all of you to follow. It should be obvious that the success stories I just told, there's no one way to get there. What they do have in common, though, is that once they got there, they gave back to the community. So now I want to very quickly go over what I consider to be essential success success factors. They're basically really intuitively obvious, so I'm going to go over it quickly, and if we have any interest, we'll talk about it in the Q&A. But before I do that, first we need to decide what do we mean by success. And it's not the same for everybody. Some of you may want to be famous, some of you may want to be rich, or powerful, or both. And still, maybe others just want to be very comfortable in his or her own skin. So the definition of success is really up to individual choice and individual decisions. First thing is you must know yourself. And what I mean by that is you need to be honest with yourself and know where your strengths and weaknesses are. Secondly, you need to know others. And by that I mean you have the skill and the empathy to be able to size up other people and know what their strengths and weaknesses are. Because in order for you to succeed, if you want to succeed and you want to build a team, you want to start a company, or to be successful in a large company, you must know what skills you don't have and what skills you can find for others that you're recruiting to your team. In America, you must keep in mind, by skilled communicator, you must keep in mind that in America, everybody is selling his or herself, marketing his or herself, probably far more than he or she really is. But if you choose to be the self-effacing type, where it's fashionable to be human, to be humble, that might be okay in China. But here, you're just putting yourself at a discount. And of course, you have to be excellent communication skills in order to market yourself effectively. You have to be able to write well, you have to be able to speak well. Whether you're joining a startup or a major corporation, you need to know what it takes to be a team player. Okay. Well, I got to wrap up, so I'm going to give you the last slide, and we'll skip some of the qualities. You must know in America that you have two biases against you. One is you are considered a good engineer, and you have to prove yourself that you're a good executive, good leader, and you constantly have to do that. The second thing, and most importantly, the U.S. government considers each one of you a potential spy for China. And I'm not joking. When situations are bad between U.S. and China, you are the suspect. And especially if you're working in a technical field, you must assume somebody is reading your email. And I don't mean hackers from PRC. The abbreviations I'm thinking of is FBI, CIA, NAS, ITF, DEA, and so on. So keep in mind, Committee 100, I'm part of a task force that goes around the country giving half-day seminars on how to stay away from trouble and not be part of a suspect of espionage. And that's a very long subject. The only advice I want to give you now is that when the FBI bangs down your door to talk to you, you have the right to remain silent. You have a right to legal counsel. Don't talk, because if you think you're cooperating by talking to them, you're wrong. Because they're just looking for some other mistakes that you said that they can hang you with. So this is really the country that we live in that you need to be sensitive to. So with that cheerful note, I'm finished with my presentation. I look forward to a vigorous panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Ken?